5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. Is Lichtman live? Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, welcome. We love our very smart and sophisticated audience. And there's a lot going on here.
You always say that.
Why not?
Oh.
You know, let's remind them that we love and appreciate them.
Oh.
Why not?
No, you always say that there's a lot going on.
You know.
Not that. I know. Yeah, I agree.
I know. I just can't help it.
Right.
You know, I've been around a long time, and I've never seen anything, not even close to this. Not even in Watergate did we have so much going on of consequence every single day.
Right.
And, of course, front and center has to be the biggest war, most destructive war in Europe since World War II. And I'll remind everyone what Donald Trump said, right? When did he say he would end the war, Sam?
I think first hour in office or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. Day one.
Day one, yeah.
He's only missed it by about 110 days with absolutely no sign of the war ending.
Well, let's talk about what happened this week. He had a big phone conversation with Vladimir Putin, right?
That is correct.
And afterwards, we actually have his original tweet here. He tweeted this long thing out. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we're just going to highlight the fact that he said, Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. That would be great, right? But then he goes on to talking about trade with Russia and how there's opportunity for massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Fast forward to today, we get this article from CNN saying Ukraine and Russia both say that drone strikes continue after the Trump-Putin call.
Yeah, not exactly ratification of what Trump said that Putin is going to do. You know, Trump has been strung along, lied to, and played like a fiddle by Vladimir Putin. Putin has gotten almost everything he's wanted out of Trump. We're not going to allow Ukraine to get into NATO. We are not going to guarantee NATO's security with American forces if the war ends. And it looks like, despite some talk out of the administration, that they were going to put pressure on Putin, which is the only thing he understands. Think he understands being nice to him? No. This is a guy who imprisons and, you know, arguably murders his political opponents.
I think he murdered Navalny. I don't think it's arguable.
I don't think it's arguable either. And he's not the only one that he's murdered. But, you know, I didn't want to be too extreme, but I think you're right. I think we can outright call him a thug, a murderer, and a dictator. And no friend of our democracy. One of his biggest goals is destroying democracy and freedom in the United States and everywhere else around the world. And just like what Donald Trump does is right out in the open, what Vladimir Putin does is right out in the open. You don't have to guess. You don't have to speculate. You don't have to hypothesize. You know exactly what he is about.
So I'm guessing your answer to our titular question, is this real peace or deception? You're saying this is total and complete deception. Total and complete deception.
The only way Putin is going to agree to peace if he gets what he wants out of Ukraine. Otherwise, he has absolutely no incentive to agree to peace. Because they control all the propaganda in Russia, the war is actually very popular. It's critical to his leadership because the war is the great diversion from the fact that the Russian economy is a mess. Ordinary people are not doing well in Russia. So, you know, it's the old wag the dog trick. You want to divert attention from problems at home, you stoke a war abroad. Plus, we know, and this is, again, you can call it speculation, but it's not. If Putin conquered Ukraine, is that it?
Well, I hope so, but doubtful.
Very doubtful. His ambitions are quite clear. He wants to restore the old Soviet empire. You know, way back in 1938, Neville Chamberlain, God rest his soul, the British Prime Minister, you know, engaged in the famous appeasement with him. Oh, we'll just give him this. You know, we'll give him the Sudetenland here in Czechoslovakia. There'll be peace in our time. And that's all he wants. That's never, ever what dictators want. They always want more. It's just like with very rich people. You know, Trump says, oh, we don't have to worry about Musk. He's so rich, he wouldn't want any more money.
I have to use the restroom. Keep
okay, no problem. I got plenty to talk about.
What do you think about this core talking point that the Kremlin keeps using about, like, we have to solve the core issues of the war, or the initial issues of the war? Have you heard them say that?
Many times. They're trying to, you know, create the fabrication, the falsehood, the gaslighting that somehow Ukraine is complicit in this war, and that the United States is complicit in this war because of expansion of NATO. You know, NATO's been around since the late 1940s. And it has not been a military attack on the Soviet Union or Russia coming out of NATO. It's not as if NATO poses an immediate existential threat. And certainly, a state hadn't even joined NATO. But even if they join NATO, that is not grounds for an invasion of a sovereign country. It almost never happens since the formation of the UN. This is one of the very few times in which one UN member aggressively invaded another UN member. And this has not been an ordinary war, as we saw from these drone strikes. The Russians have mercilessly attacked Ukrainian infrastructure, attacked civilian targets. And we just learned today, I just saw it an hour or two ago on CNN, and they had the video. It wasn't just a report, wasn't anonymous sources like the insufferable book on Biden. This is actual proof that the Russians ordered and carried out the execution of Ukrainian prisoners who've surrendered. You know, an absolute war crime, a defined war crime under the Geneva Conventions. And this is the guy that Trump, you know, thinks he can just do business with, who's just going to, you know, seek a peaceful solution in Ukraine and engage in all kinds of positive relationships with the United States. Putin understands one thing, and one thing only, and that's power. Nothing more. I remember, just like Stalin, you know, the dictator of the Soviet Union. I remember at one time an American ambassador was talking to Stalin about what kind of power could be projected, and he was talking about diplomatic power and soft power, and Stalin said to him, I don't want to hear anything about that. I want to know how many army divisions you could put on the front. That's all I want to hear about. Same thing with Putin. That's the only thing he understands. And there had been some talk about the Trump administration hitting Putin where it hurts, pressuring him with additional sanctions. But that now seems to be off the table. In fact, just the opposite. You know, once again, Trump seems to be playing on Putin's grounds and not on the grounds of the United States, and certainly not giving a fair shake to the Ukrainians. Let me stress again how miraculous it was that the Ukrainians defied all the experts, all the authorities, all the pundits who thought the great Russian steamroller would ride right over Ukraine and conquer them in a matter of weeks or months at most. They've now survived for 3 years and given the Russians all they can get, despite, you know, not having anywhere near the military power, the population, or the industrial base as the Russians. And staunch American support is critical for that. And, I have to worry whether or not the Trump administration is going to maintain that staunch, essential military, economic, and political support for the very brave Ukrainians. But right now, it looks like Putin has totally played Trump. Trump has made all kinds of concessions, and guess what he's gotten in return? Absolutely nothing. Killing of surrendered prisoners, drone strikes, even after the so-called excellent talks between Trump and Putin. But there are a couple of other things on my mind as well that I want to talk to you about. According to credible press reports, and every time I think I can't be shocked anymore, somehow I'm shocked again. And that's a really high threshold that Trump and his administration have to achieve, but they've done it. According to credible press reports, they have sent some undocumented immigrants, get this, to South Sudan. Are these immigrants Sudanese? Apparently not. Are they even African? Apparently not. Apparently they are Asians and are being sent to a country that they know nothing about, have nothing to do with. Moreover, this is in direct violation of a court order. It says you can't just summarily send people to countries that aren't their countries of origin and they have no ties to. But it's much worse than that. South Sudan is not a random country. It is one of the most dangerous countries in the world, one of the least democratic, one of the ones that violates human rights most significantly. What do you think the State Department says about travel for any American to South Sudan? It's level 4, the highest level. Do not travel to South Sudan. If you're there, get out of South Sudan. That's how dangerous it is. I'm not going to read you the entire State Department report as to why no American should ever go to South Sudan and why it's so dangerous. I'll just read you a couple of excerpts. Armed conflict is ongoing throughout Sudan and includes heavy fighting between various political and security groups. The situation is violent, extremely unpredictable. Armed conflict, crime, such as kidnapping, armed robbery, home invasion, carjacking occurs. There is terrorist activity that is unpredictable. Can you imagine going to this, being forced to go to this place when you have absolutely nothing to do with it? You're going to stand out like a sore thumb because you have no ties, you have no ethnic or racial basis to be there. This is what I talked about when I thought they were considering sending undocumented immigrants to Libya. This is monstrous. It is monstrous. It is a violation of the most basic of human rights. And it's not accidental. You don't accidentally ship people off to South Sudan. That's not, a destination that you might just happen to go to by accident. You have to be very, very deliberate about sending someone to South Sudan. So this isn't accidental. Here is what I believe is going on. Same thing with sending people to that hellhole in El Salvador. They want to be cruel. I repeat that. And it's a horrific allegation, but I believe it. It's my opinion, but I believe it's true. They want to be horrifically cruel because they want to discourage any migrants from coming to the United States, and they want to encourage undocumented immigrants who are here to so-called self-deport. That is, leave the country voluntarily rather than being sent to a hellhole in El Salvador or one of the most dangerous countries in the world, least humane, least democratic countries in the world, in South Sudan. And apparently they couldn't care less what the courts have said. The judge is furious. He believes they grossly violated his order, or her order, which says you cannot just deport people to countries that are not their countries of origin, they don't have ties to, without giving them a chance to do due process. And, of course, one of the few tools that the courts have, even though they are a co-equal branch of government, against executive overreach and authoritarianism, is the power of contempt. And guess what is in that so-called big, beautiful bill that's supposed to be on taxes and spending, but it's all kinds of other things on guns, on giving Trump authority to suspend tax exemptions of organizations he claims have terrorist ties. And one of the other things that's in there that has nothing to do with taxes and spending, but has everything to do with eviscerating the courts and eliminating the courts as a real check on the Trump administration, is a limitation of the ability of the federal courts to enforce their judicial orders. I'm quoting here from one of the nation's leading constitutional authorities. You know, you often hear me say I'm not a lawyer. Well, this is Ermin Chemerinsky, a law school dean.
That's not a real name.
It is a real name, and I know this guy for many, many decades.
Chemerinsky?
Chemerinsky.
Okay.
A provision in the proposed spending bill would restrict the authority of federal courts to hold governments officials in contempt when they violate court orders. Without the contempt power, judicial orders are meaningless and can be ignored. They're already ignoring them.
Right.
And now they want to make sure they can ignore them with impunity by sticking in a bill that's supposed to be on spending and taxes. And in fact, if it's not on spending and taxes, you can't use the so-called reconciliation and pass a bill just with a majority vote in the Senate. But this is one of the horrific things that they have stuck into this bill to eviscerate the third branch of government and essentially give Trump and his allies authoritarian power to do anything they want, which he's claimed he has anyway, without a check by the courts. But that's not it.
Well, tell us.
Who's the chief immigration officer, the head honcho, the head of the big department in the United States? Do you know who that is?
Kristi Noem.
Kristi Noem,
Yeah.
right? The head of Department of Homeland Security, who supervises, monitors, controls all immigration policies. And she was asked, because, you know, there's been this talk about the administration, we've discussed it previously, suspending one of our most fundamental rights, a right that goes back to the Magna Carta, and has only been suspended in the most dire circumstances, like the Civil War or the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so she was asked, what does habeas corpus represent? Do you know what she said, Sam?
Yeah, I believe she said something like it represents the right of the president to take people's rights away.
To deport people.
Yeah, or something.
It's exactly the opposite.
The opposite, right.
I mean, you could not come up with something that is more opposite. The right of habeas corpus says you cannot be detained or sent to prison or be deported without the government showing cause.
You think she
show the body is what it's all about.
You think she actually doesn't know, or do you think she was just trying to spew some propaganda?
You know, I don't know which is more horrific. That
Right.
we have the head of Homeland Security who has no clue about the meaning of one of our most basic rights. There are only two rights, actually, embedded in the Constitution. 2 or 3, bills of attainder, ex parte, and habeas corpus. Most of the other rights are in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And not to know, not only not to know, but to say just the opposite of what habeas corpus represents is horrific and chilling either way. To have someone heading DHS who is so ignorant, or someone who is so evil to fundamentally misrepresent and destroy one of the most basic rights of our democracy and of any democracy. As I said, this goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. You know, we now have a purveyor of junk science as head of health in the United States. And by the way, apparently just today he lied to the Congress, saying we have a team in Milwaukee working with Milwaukee officials to deal with their crisis of lead in the water. And guess what the Milwaukee officials said?
Not true.
Not true. There's no one here.
Yeah.
There's no team from Health and Human Services. And meanwhile, they're restricting our access to vaccines, putting out all kinds of false information, cutting back critical research and services, you know. And now we seem to have someone who is a purveyor of quack law as head of Department of Homeland Security.
My take is I don't think she actually knows what habeas corpus is.
You think she's just that ignorant?
I mean, has she ever been a lawyer? How did she make her rise in politics? Was she ever a lawyer? I think she was like a businesswoman or
Doesn't
something.
matter. If you are going to be head of...
I agree.
First of all, she was a governor. A governor should know what people's rights are.
But I'm saying...
And then if you're going to be head of Department of Homeland Security... This is not something that's esoteric, Sam. I said it's one of the very few rights that's actually in the original Constitution. It is one of the most fundamental rights that's been established to set up people's freedom throughout history.
Yeah.
There's no excuse for not knowing this.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm just saying, if I had to make a bet, I would bet she actually doesn't know what habeas corpus is. That's my bet.
I don't know how we'd ever resolve that bet, but I can't disagree with you.
The thing I don't understand about RFK Jr. either is that he seems so worried about things like dyes in our foods and vaccines, but he's not worried about lead in Milwaukee. Like, his whole line of reasoning makes no logical sense. You would think, like, we know for a fact that lead is not good for you. If he's so concerned about all of these chemicals and dyes in our life that are hurting us, you'd think lead would be at the top of his list.
Lead should be at the very top of the list because there's no dispute about how bad lead is, particularly for children.
Right.
It is one of the most. And by the way, they've also abrogated the controls over forever chemicals in our water.
It doesn't make any it doesn't. Their whole ideological line of reasoning doesn't make any sense to me.
That's partly why it's so frightening.
Right.
You know, how do you respond to things that are so outlandish and, as you say, make so little sense and are so outside the mainstream of the law, of science, of democracy, you know? And, you know, you called me out, but it was proven this is a real phrase, gish gallop. It comes at you so fast and so constantly. I saw a really interesting poll the other day. I don't give much credence to horse race polls, but polls on people's attitudes as snapshots can be helpful. And this was a poll that looked at Trump's approval rating in light of people's knowledge of what he did. Okay. And they used as their standard, because you just can't generally ask, do you know what Trump's doing? Whether they were aware of the situation involving Albrego Garcia, right, which has been all over the news. Right. The guy who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, and they've, refused to do anything to bring him back. It was dramatic. There was a huge gap between those who knew something about the Garcia situation and those who didn't. And guess what the direction the gap was?
I don't know. Republicans.
Not just Republicans, just people who either knew or didn't know. And do you think Trump did better with those who knew or didn't know?
Didn't know.
Not even close. An enormous gap in Trump's approval between those who knew and those who didn't know. And if you don't know that one...
So was I right?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So I'll give you big credit.
Yes.
Give you a gold star.
Yes.
That was all over the news, a huge story. It's been going on for weeks. And yet a big segment of our population knew nothing about it, which probably means they know little or nothing about anything Trump has done. They might have heard Trump, but they don't really know what he's doing. And that is the underlying secret why he's hovering around 40, low 40%.
Hovering? That's okay. That's not a word.
Yes, it is.
Hovering?
H-O-V-E-R.
Hovering?
I don't know if you pronounce it hovering or hovering.
Hovering is not a word.
Hovering. At any rate, that's the dirty secret as to why his approval rating isn't even much lower than it is right now, because people just don't know what he's doing. Final thing I want to mention, just briefly, is a pretty puzzling Supreme Court decision.
Before you get to that, I want to add something to the Sudan case.
Sure.
That I don't think you've talked about or anybody in the mainstream media has talked about, as for the reason why they are sending...
I did go into that when you were away.
I know, but I'm saying you didn't talk about this reason.
Okay, good.
Dinero, money. These places are willing to take these undocumented folks for, in the scheme of things, fairly cheaply. One, they're willing to take them,
Right, so you don't have to spend money housing them, detaining them in the U.S., which is very expensive.
Well, I think, one, a lot of countries just won't take them, right? Germany's not going to take them.
Most democratic countries won't take them. So you got to go to these horrible dictatorships.
Right, horrible dictatorships. And like I said, it's cheaper than, like you said, housing them in the U.S., giving them their due process, putting them through the legal system, taking each one of them, sending them back to their country of origin. You pay South Sudan this lump sum of money, and they'll just take them.
Same thing with El Salvador.
Same thing with El Salvador.
We don't have proof that they paid money to South Sudan because it just happened.
We do have proof about El Salvador.
I'm about to say we do have proof about the millions sent to El Salvador. Absolutely. Let's bribe the dictator. Really easy thing to do. Money talks. Nobody walks in El Salvador. Hey, that was pretty good.
That was pretty good.
Yeah. So I just want to briefly mention a puzzling, unsigned, unreasoned order which said that Trump can continue to deport people under the Alien Enemies Act of the late 18th century, which I found very puzzling because there's much less harm if you stop him. There's really no harm, but there's a lot of harm if you let him do it. But they did say you can't disregard due process. They've said this several times now, at least twice, that you can't just say, you're a gang member, you're going off to some hellhole abroad. You've got to give people an opportunity to contest it. And what has Trump said? Oh, that's inconvenient. We'd have too many trials. Yes, democracy, civil rights, political rights are sometimes inconvenient, but that's why we have them.
I agree with you.
Wow, you do? Anything else you want to say?
You keep slip sliding away. Well,
I know.
I know you want. Justin Rubenstein donated $2, and I say, what do you think of Jake Tapper's book? I know you were chomping at the bit to talk about that.
I haven't read it, and I don't intend to read it.
To give people some context, it's called Original Sin, which is about the, quote, cover-up of Biden's health decline or cognitive
decline. One, I hate the title. Original sin is the sin of Adam and Eve when they bit the apple, from which, all human misery, has followed. That's way hyperbolic for what they found. And while I haven't read the book, I've watched their interviews, I've read their interviews, I've read their commentary.
And their excerpts.
And as far as I could tell, the book relies on anonymous, unnamed sources. And you can take a book based on anonymous, unnamed sources and do with it what the great British philosopher David Hume said you should do to works of superstition. Consign them to the flames. How, as an historian, I've been a working historian for, God knows, 60 years, our hallmark, the thing we always do as historians, is document our sources, right?
I don't know. I'm not a historian.
Yeah, but you know from hanging out with me.
Oh, yeah, hanging out, brother. Yeah.
See my book there? Conservative at the Core.
Yeah.
A New History of American Conservatism. Over 1,000 footnotes.
Wow.
How many anonymous sources did I use?
I'm assuming 0.
0. How can you verify anonymous, unnamed sources? How could Biden and his family defend themselves against a book based upon anonymous, unnamed sources. It's absolutely impossible. And why in the world are we focusing on Biden? He's not the president. He's gone. He's irrelevant. Donald Trump is the president. And from my layperson's point of view, and, you know, Jake Tapper is as much a layperson as I am, it's manifest differently, but I have seen just as much cognitive decline in Donald Trump. He's forgotten where he is. He's gotten the names of people. He called Elon Musk Leon. He's rambled about Arnold Palmer's penis or the late, great Hannibal Lecter. We can go on and on. It manifests differently, but it's still there. Plus, you know, if Biden was so far gone even many months before he was forced out, how in the world was he able to give one of the best State of the Union addresses? And it wasn't just from the teleprompter. He was responding and dealing effectively with the audience. How was he able to make several arduous, successful trips abroad? You know, I'll pose those things, which we can actually see, against these anonymous, unnamed sources. My final word to the authors: shame, shame, shame.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. The fact that it's about Biden, it's a past presidency. I mean, historians and reporters write about past presidents and past administrations all the time. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing or a demotion to them.
I agree with that. Nothing wrong with writing about past presidents. But they're using this. They're not just making a contribution to scholarship.
Sure, but how many people wrote books after the Trump presidency?
Yeah, that's fair. But again, it's a diversion. And yeah, they have a perfect right to do it. You know, historical record is very important, but you don't build an historical record on anonymous, unnamed sources. It's worthless.
But don't
as part of the historical record.
Maybe I'm confused. I feel like I hear journalists or see journalists using anonymous sources and often defending the use of keeping their sources anonymous. I've heard Trump rail about anonymous sources before too.
Yeah, and I think they're a problem. Okay. And, you know, I have no problem with using anonymous sources to guide you to things. It's what Woodward and Bernstein did with Deep Throat. They weren't quoting Deep Throat as an anonymous source. They were using him to guide them to things. But, you know, particularly when you're making such spectacular accusations on a human level, if nothing else, plus on a political level, I think you need to do something more than have unnamed, anonymous sources. Because how is the human being involved going to defend themselves?
Coca-Cola says, but Deep Throat was a source.
Yes, mostly to guide them to sources they were able to document. And again, I hold journalistic articles to a different standard than scholarly books. Journalists call themselves the first draft of history. And I'd have to say, in the profession of journalism, the standards are not the same as in the profession of history.
And it seems to me like maybe their larger point is Biden and his aides and the people around him should have either encouraged him to step down, give up the presidency, you know, say within year 2 that he wasn't going to run, he was going to open the field. Do you think that's a valid criticism to say, hey, Biden and or Biden's people, you should have left a long time ago?
Hard to know. He's not a neurologist. He's not a psychologist. As I said, there was no indication that I was able to see, and I follow this, that Biden wasn't doing the job as president.
Right.
He amassed the greatest set of domestic policy achievements of any president since the 1960s, hands down. It wasn't even close. As I said, you know, he went on these arduous, successful foreign trips. It was Biden and Biden alone who put together the coalition of the West that stopped Putin cold from conquering Ukraine. It wasn't Macron, wasn't Trudeau, wasn't anyone else. It was Biden. So in terms of performance, there is no evidence that his performance was, subpar because of some cognitive decline. In fact, I think history will show that for the most part he was not a great president, but quite a good president, as opposed to Donald Trump.
Right. I mean, generally speaking, I agree that this book is pretty frivolous. I mean, the fact that he's forgetting names of people he's known for a long time.
Hey, I do that.
Yeah, this idea of a cover-up, I mean, we all knew he was an old mother
yes,
effer.
Of
you know
course.
what I mean?
What were they covering up?
What exactly were they covering up?
Exactly.
It was very public. I knew it. You knew it.
Your brilliant mother knew it.
The public knew it.
We all know. We talked about it a lot.
This word cover-up is really confusing to me. And I agree that I'm not going to get into the whole anonymous source now, but even the examples they use seem pretty frivolous. And it's like, yeah, people I know in their 80s also do that kind of stuff.
I do that every once in a while.
Everybody does.
Yeah. Right. This was not some great secret. It was much more secret when Franklin Roosevelt in 1944 covered up the fact that he was deathly ill, and in fact died, shortly after he took his fourth oath of office. Presidents throughout history have covered. George Washington was deathly ill with some kind of fever. He thought he was going to die. They covered that up. Grover Cleveland had cancer. He had to have surgery on his jaw. Guess where they performed the surgery? Out on a ship at sea.
Oh, really?
So that no one would know that he had cancer and had an operation. We all know how Woodrow Wilson tried to conceal his impairment from the strokes that he had late in his presidency. Kennedy was beset with all kinds of illnesses and ailments, including Addison's disease. And, what was the image of Kennedy as this, strong, vigorous, young, football-playing president. This is as old as the Republic.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, you ready to get to some questions?
I'm always ready. And, our questions have been so good. And, someday I will even say I'm ready to take questions about the opera, but not today.
Wow, that's a big...
That would be hell of a concession.
If you're a long-time listener, that's big.
And I know you got your housekeeping.
Before we get to that, some housekeeping notes. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. We've got 1,100, almost 1,200 people watching, but only 400 likes. Come on, guys, we got to get those likes up. Make sure you subscribe and you turn that notification bell on. I think I was looking today, and I think it only said 12% of our subscribers have the notification bell on. You got to have that notification bell on.
And become a member, not just a subscriber.
You didn't let me get to that.
Oh, sorry. I don't want to rain on your parade.
You already did.
Oh, no.
Our first question is from Peggy Cox. They say, Professor, does the current stalled House bill, in essence, while not explicitly grant immunity to Trump administration officials, it would make it more challenging for courts to enforce their orders against the Trump administration? It prohibits courts from using federal funds to comply with court order. This would get rid of judiciary, so we would be in a full dictatorship. Then Trump can sentence you to life in prison for anything he wants, or even a parking ticket if he wants to.
I'm not sure I'd go quite as far as that last question, but the last sentence. But the essence of your comment is absolutely correct. In this, 1,100-page bill are all kinds of poison pills, as we've been discussing on this show. And as you correctly point out, very smartly, some of the worst poison pills have to do with eviscerating the ability of federal courts to enforce their orders. I just read a little bit earlier a quotation, not from me, but from one of the leading constitutional scholars in America. I know you don't think he's real, but he is. Erwin Chemerinsky, who said, talking about the bill eviscerating the contempt power, quote, without the contempt power, judicial orders are meaningless and can be ignored. And of course, there are other provisions, as you point out, related to the ability of courts to enforce their orders. This was all slipped in to a bill where all the attention is being paid on the tax and spending part of it, and all these poison pills are being overlooked, including the attack on the judiciary, which indeed would go a long way to turning Trump into what he thinks he is already, and that's a king.
Kev in the chat says Poison Pill is a good name for a rock band. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Should you and I start a rock band?
Yeah, let me hear your best rock ballad.
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
I think that's a bad idea. I think we'll stick to the show.
Okay. Ron Paul often criticizes Lincoln for suspending habeas corpus. How do historians generally view that decision? Was it necessary or an abuse of power?
You know, it's so hard to know in retrospect. It certainly was not an unreasonable decision, although historians disagree about that. Lincoln was very concerned that they were going to lose the war. In fact, in 1864, when he was up for re-election, he wrote a note to be opened after the election in which he thought that the war was going to continue to go at least a stalemate or maybe badly, and that he would lose the election to his former do-nothing General McClellan. And he said he hoped somehow they can keep the Union together. So for good reason, he was incredibly frightened, and he was very frightened about subversion from within. Let's not forget, a lot of border states were in the Union, which harbored a lot of Southern sympathizers. The pejorative term for them were copperheads. And so certainly there was some reason in this dire emergency to suspend habeas corpus, although certainly not every historian would agree it was necessary. Very hard retrospective judgment to be made. And, of course, later on, Congress disagreed, the courts disagreed with the president. This is the only time, as far as I know, and habeas corpus has very rarely been suspended. The last time was after Pearl Harbor. This is the only time, I believe, and if you have any information different, let me know. But I believe this is the only time when habeas corpus was suspended without authorization from Congress.
I think Lincoln's was authorized after the fact.
Exactly.
But other than that, yeah, I think it's always
I think it was the only thing that wasn't authorized at the time, obviously. Congress, I don't even think, was in session at the time he suspended the right.
A $10 donation from Def Leopard Rules Rock. They say, if a peace deal is not brokered and it results in the fall of Kyiv or a stalemate in the Russia-Ukraine war, will it trigger the foreign/military policy failure key to false?
Well, you know what I'm always reluctant to do.
That's an interesting question, though.
Yes, it's a great question. I'm always reluctant to speculate and talk about hypotheticals. But it's still so early to begin turning keys. But let me just say, hypothetically, speculatively, for what it's worth, I don't think just a stalemate would turn the key, but I think if Putin conquered Ukraine, it would.
Can we please get a history lesson on instances where the people overthrew fascist regimes and how they did it? It would be also nice to discuss the world trend against Trumpism with Canada, Australia, and now Poland and Romania voting against Trump.
We did talk a little bit about Romania,
and we've talked about Canada and Australia.
So we have discussed that. And obviously, I'm not going to go into a history lesson now, but we'll take that under advisement.
This is from Jim Blowers. They say...
Oh, one of our longtime friends.
Yes. They say Comey made a social media post with seashells on a beach that spelled out 8647. Jim says, to me it means reject Trump, but Trump takes it to mean assassinate. So an investigation of Comey started. Is this an abridgment of freedom of speech?
Oh, it's my opinion. I certainly think so. To term this as an assassination threat is a far-fetched, extreme interpretation of what was done. Trump has far more explicitly promoted violence against President Biden and other political figures he didn't like. Look at some of the images of Biden being body slammed or being hogtied at the back of a truck, or he's talking about firing rifles in the face of Liz Cheney. He is engaged in far more explicit incitements of violence against presidents and political figures than this represents.
I don't know who made the merch, but I know there was MAGA merch that said 8646. So
it started even before.
Well, I'm saying MAGA used this exact term for Biden.
I gotcha. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
The 46th president instead of the 47th president. Yeah. So it's a little hypocritical.
And we know MAGA engages in death threats all the time. We can say that firsthand.
VP J.D. Vance called Trump the H Germany word and not fit to be POTUS.
I do remember that. That was way back.
Right.
Way back.
But when he was nominated for VP, he kissed the ring. Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham had similar words and opinions about Trump. Is this style of acrobatic politics common in other democracies? Does integrity matter in our modern politics?
Well, you see acrobatic politics everywhere. I'm not an expert in every country, but it's far more extreme here for the GOP. What was my one-sentence definition of current American politics, Sam?
Tell them.
Democrats have no spine. Republicans have no principles. If you have no principles, all you care about is power, control, and money. And so it doesn't matter what you said at any given point in time. I go back to what Richard Nixon's press secretary said about Richard Nixon's lying. He said, what he said is now inoperative, right? So what we said about Trump is now inoperative. Circumstances have changed, and since we have no principles, we can just turn around and make what we said before inoperative.
But has it always been this bad in American politics?
No, this is the worst we've ever seen.
Where there doesn't seem to be any sort of North Star or moral compass that exists. It's like, if your party is doing something bad, you sweep it under the rug.
But it's not both sides. We've never seen anything like this from Trump and his cronies, either from any prior Republican. Even Nixon was never anywhere near this bad, or from any prior Democratic administration.
Alex Kawa said, "You said you're fond of Cory Booker. How do you feel about him being the sole Dem to vote to confirm Jared Kushner's father, a convicted felon, as ambassador to France?"
Well, the main fault there is obviously with Trump. He's not only a convicted felon. From everything I know about him, he is, a totally immoral individual.
Why did Booker vote for him?
I have no idea. I was shocked, and I really can't answer the question because I haven't heard any explanation of why Booker would have voted for this guy. So I'm kind of shocked and at a loss. But it seems pretty bad.
Miles Wolf says, "It would seem that Trump would win the most keys if he simply kept doing what Biden was doing and just took all the credit for it. Have presidents rode off the coattails of their predecessors before? And is there any reason why Trump can't do that if he wanted to?"
Absolutely, there's an historical parallel. There are a number of them, but the most obvious is George H.W. Bush in 1988. George H.W. Bush was a terrible candidate. He was the figure who reminded every woman of the first boyfriend they had dumped. He couldn't complete a sentence. He called Dan Rather Barbara on national television. True stuff.
That's funny.
Democrats were so confident, they said, if we lose to this guy, we might as well leave the country. But he won, and he won pretty handily because he was running on the record of the Reagan administration. Peace, prosperity, tranquility at home, big breakthroughs with the Russians.
The Ruskies. Can you do a Russian accent?
No. You keep asking me, things that are outside of my skill set.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. Our good friend Philip H. says, "Did you hear about Noam pushing a reality show pitting immigrants against each other for citizenship? Your thoughts? Is that real?"
I heard a rumor to that effect. Yes.
I haven't even heard.
That's that. You can't keep up with all of this. It's gish gallop.
That can't be real.
You put that past them. The administration that's sending people to South Sudan wouldn't stoop to do this. Come on.
It's not that this is lower than that. It's just more absurd.
But they're operating in the theater of the absurd. And what made Donald Trump? What catapulted him to be a political figure after he was totally discarded for all those bankruptcies?
Reality TV.
Reality TV. So this doesn't surprise me at all. As horrific it is in its own right. It's obviously not sending people to, horrible places abroad, but it's pretty awful to, exploit people in this way. But they don't care.
No, they certainly don't care. The Department of Justice continues to protect Trump and his criminal behavior. Is there any other route to charge him with a violation of the Emoluments Clause? Unfortunately,
the Emoluments Clause, which says, we've discussed it before in the show, an officer of the United States, including the president, cannot accept anything of value from a foreign entity. Anything of value. Certainly not a $400 million jet plane, but that's another matter. But the problem with the Emoluments Clause, it has no enforcement. It's not a criminal statute. It's a constitutional provision. And the framers thought it was fundamental because their biggest fear was corruption from abroad, corruption of the chief executive in particular. So this was central. This was not a fringe part of the Constitution. And they presumed that the enforcement would be what, Sam, if not the criminal law? How do you enforce something bad a president does? Impeachment. And we know that's not going to happen. So there really isn't much you can do to enforce the Emoluments Clause. And no matter what Trump does, he's not going to get indicted by the Department of Justice because he has all this immunity, if nothing else, plus Pam Bondi, who I predicted, could be the Attorney General and would be just as bad as Gates without the baggage, maybe worse, just as whatever Trump wants her to do. So they would never, ever come down on Trump or a Trump crony, no matter how grossly they violated the law. So sadly, there really isn't, other than public opinion, right now a way of enforcing the Emoluments Clause. Some have suggested that maybe Trump can be indicted and tried under state laws for committing state crimes, but probably the Supreme Court would step in and invoke his immunity even there.
So Trump announces an investigation about Kamala and celebrity endorsements. Kash Patel says he's going after Habitat for Humanity, and MAGA Barbie Caroline Levitt, that's not my words, keeps spouting her idiocy. And no one seems to be paying attention to the storm calamity in Kentucky and the fact that Doge cuts have made the government response sorely lacking. Do you think their lunacy is intentional to distract attention or just normal behavior for them? Frankly, I don't think they're savvy enough to coordinate things like that.
You really put your finger on something of vital importance.
That's from Cosmo Trilby.
Thank you. Another old friend of ours.
Yes.
Two things are at play here. One, somehow people don't realize that, they have eviscerated the ability of the federal government to respond to natural disasters, which, strangely enough, mostly occur in red states. The tornadoes in the middle of the country, the hurricanes in South Carolina and Florida, the drought in Arizona,
Louisiana, Texas, a lot of hurricanes.
Exactly. Alabama, Mississippi. And somehow people don't realize what Trump has done to harm them directly, personally, and severely. Plus, somehow, for some reason I cannot fathom, people seem to not be concerned or to be unaware of catastrophic climate change. Why are we now getting unprecedented tornadoes, wildfires, droughts, sea level rises, hurricanes? 97% of scientists, 97%, and maybe a little higher now, maybe 99%, attribute this to not just random fluctuations in the weather, but to human-caused climate change, which they predict is going to have a much worse catastrophic effect on our planet, our well-being, and our survival. And the people in Kentucky and Missouri and Florida and Louisiana are directly being victimized by this, and yet they're supporting an administration that not only isn't going to do anything about climate change, but is going to make it much, much worse.
Yeah, it's pretty sad.
How much time do we have left?
5 minutes. How many more questions do you want?
4 more.
4 more.
Oh, do we have some good news after this?
Yeah, the good news is the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this.
Nice.
Woo! Go like this. Woo!
That's exciting.
Go like this. Woo!
No, I'm not going to do that.
Elon Musk today just said, quote, "I think I've done enough," end quote, and backing away from politics altogether. Apparently, he's rage quit politics after how much he was bullied and how his reputation is worse. How sad is that?
Nothing that involved
at all.
Yeah, I'm not crying any tears for a guy who's worth hundreds of billions of dollars, who has engaged in some of the most cruelest activities we've ever seen by someone of importance in this country, firing people left and right without cause, not caring about what it does to their personal lives, whether mothers are going to have problems funding the medical bills for disabled kids. People have problems, feeding their families, paying their rent. These are not billionaires that you're harming. They are ordinary, hardworking Americans who you fired for absolutely no good cause. Nobody should feel sorry for Elon Musk.
You know what I have to say to Elon Musk?
Yeah. That says it all.
That says it all. Is it possible to coup-proof our government without descending into fascism or anarchy?
You can't coup-proof a government, as
Say
we
that
saw.
10 times fast.
Yeah, with January 6th. The best you can do is uphold the safeguards of democracy, which are the separation of powers into 3 branches, so no one branch can become all-powerful, the enforcement of all of our basic rights as embedded in the Bill of Rights and to a lesser extent in the original Constitution as well. But, as we're seeing, it's very, very difficult to stop someone who has all the powers of the presidency and is willing to deploy those powers ruthlessly in order to impose his authoritarian will on the country. It's a real test of our fortitude. And, on this show, I've given you many ways in which you can combat this, organize, vote, support organizations like Coup and ACLU that are fighting back, contact your congressmen, your senators, your local officials, speak at functions, write letters to the editor. There are things we all can do. And that's what we're doing here on this show. We're trying to defend fundamentally our freedom and our democracy.
Bonnie Miller says, "Dear Professor Lichtman, I know that you are not a lawyer, but you are a scholar. Historically, has the United States ever seen such a fascist-leaning Supreme Court?"
Well, I'm not going to use the word fascist because, I don't want to be accused of being extremist myself. But we have certainly had very conservative-leaning Supreme Courts. It was, for example, the Supreme Court that in the famous 1857 Dred Scott decision, one of the worst decisions in history, declared slaves property who had no rights, couldn't even petition in court, and remained property even if they were in free states. And by the way, the Dred Scott decision was one of the motivating factors for something that is very much in the news today because Trump is trying to eliminate it. You know what that is, Sam?
No.
The birthright.
Oh.
Establishing citizenship for everyone born in the U.S. And that includes children of people who were here illegally. People don't realize this. Thousands of slaves were imported into the U.S. illegally after the international slave trade was abolished by an act of 1807. They were here illegally, and yet all of their children were made citizens without controversy under the birthright provision of the 14th Amendment.
All right, our final question of the night is a sports question.
Oh,
this is from.
I may defer that to you.
No, you won't. Trust me. This is from James. They say, my late dad would tell me several stories about Willis Reed, Walt Clyde Frazier, Bill Bradley, and several Nick greats. What do you think are their chances this year to win the conference and maybe even the NBA title?
Oh, I'll never forget the injured Willis Reed walking on the court, to an incredible ovation. He didn't do much in that game, actually, but it was just absolutely extraordinary that he would appear at all, and it really energized the Knicks. And, of course, there's hardly anyone better as a backcourter than Walt Clyde Frazier. Bill Bradley, had a great shot, was probably even better in college than he was in the pros, and then went on to become a United States Senator from New Jersey and challenge Al Gore in 2000 for the Democratic presidential nomination. Look, the Knicks have vastly outperformed expectations. The smart money, and never listened to the smart money, was that they'd be swept 4-0 by the Celtics. Instead, they beat the Celtics 4-2. And it wasn't just because of Tatum's injury. They had already lost that game when Tatum was injured. They were up 9. The Knicks were with a couple of minutes to go, 2.5 minutes or so. They weren't going to win that game anyway, and they still would have been down 3-1. So, yeah, I think based on what the Knicks have done previously, they have a real shot. I'm not predicting that they're going to win the NBA title, but this is the best shot they've had in 25 years.
I would say they have a 59% chance to win the Eastern Conference Finals and a 43% chance to win the NBA Finals.
I'll take that. That's a hell of a lot better than a month ago. Gotta be careful with my right hand. I have a bad shoulder.
What'd I do? That hurts it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have no cartilage in my right shoulder from all those years of playing tennis and softball and everything else, racquetball, you name it.
Yikes. Okay. With that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for the night. The good news is the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this. Dad, what are your final words to the people?
Keep the faith. We've tried to put a positive spin on things by indicating all the ways in which we as ordinary citizens can fight for our freedom and our democracy. So never despair. Keep working. I'm always go back to one of my great old friends, the incredible folk singer Kristen Lems, who sings the song, "We will never give up, we will never give in."
Can you give us a quick rendition of that song?
Maybe next time we'll get Kristen on.
Okay, Kristen. Hit up Savannah. All right. With that, he will say goodnight. I will see you all in the post show.
That's awesome. Take care.